It's gone from being about counter-terrorism at all to becoming an India-Pakistan conflict. We should be wary of not getting back into the situation where when people think India, they also think Pakistan. We don't want that. I have to say, I'm stunned when I see fake news and things running on channels willing to just put their own reputation at risk. Right now, it is impossible to talk about peace with Pakistan. There was a accidental misfiring of an Indian missile that went into Pakistan. One would have thought the COVID pandemic would be a great unifier for the world. Instead, it showed us how badly the global powers could behave. For the first time, we are seeing the US actively shy away from an open role. Famous cliche is always that it's not a state with an army, but an army with a state. The solution will not come from any of us. It will come only when there are two leaders who decide that they will not benefit from any kind of a peaceful solution, but their grandchildren will. I wouldn't say when it comes to India, Pakistan, that any of these neighbors take Pakistan's side over India. The fear is that it will not be replaced by another world order, but by no world order.
Something needs to be done about just overall standard journalism as well. Suhasini, welcome to SparX. Really looking forward to this conversation. I think I was going through, your background. So it's been nearly 3 decades since you've been covering foreign policy, conflicts, geopolitics, and looks like last couple of years things have really intensified. It seemed at some point we were heading towards a more and more prolonged peace, etc. But we have 2 wars have been raging on for last Ukraine 3 years, I think Israel, Gaza 2 years, and looks like we are on the brink of third one, with the way things have gone last few days. How do you assess the current situation? Is there a reasonable possibility of off-ramp with what's going on, or it's just we don't know how it pans out?
See, India and Pakistan have always had tensions, always have conflicts. As a result, we do have mechanisms normally in place that can make an off-ramp. But in this case, I think firstly, the particular barbarity of the Pahalgam attack has made it clear that there has to be some acknowledgement from Pakistan that they will crack down on terror groups, or some acknowledgement from Pakistan that, okay, whatever happened, they would, they now want to pull back from this kind of warfare. And we also have a government who's made it clear that every time there is this kind of provocation, there will be an attack. Now, some have suggested that that reduces our options and increases the chances of a conflict, but that's what we're looking at right now.
But what are the odds that Pakistan will publicly acknowledge anything with respect to supporting terrorism? They've almost never done this, and under attack, and the only instinct will be to counter-attack and position themselves internally that, they are able to fend off the aggression. So I'm not...
You're right. It's gone from being about counter-terrorism at all to becoming an India-Pakistan conflict. There is one time Pakistan admitted. That was after Mumbai. In fact, people forget that this was... I know that, a lot of people were very angry that India did not attack Pakistan at the time. But in 2008, there was sufficient international pressure brought through by Indian diplomacy that made Pakistan admit, firstly, they couldn't do otherwise. We had a Pakistani national, Ajmal Kasab, caught here. So they admitted that the men who came to to Mumbai were Pakistanis. They then set up a case and found the links of the boat. They found shells for the explosives that were used in Mumbai. They found those in training camps in Sindh. They found the handlers, the people who were in the control room. But at some point around 2014, 2015, they put the lid on their own investigation. But that is the one and only time, first and last, in fact, diplomats say that Pakistan admitted that a terror attack had been planned, funded, trained inside Pakistan.
And maybe that helped avert, more aggressive stance at that time. Maybe, I don't know. But look, zooming out, and you must have looked at India-Pakistan situation, many times in different contexts. We've already had 3 wars, pretty much on the brink of 4th, and maybe it has started, we're just not acknowledging it yet. But things don't seem to change at all. The things are just stuck wherever they are. It's just a simmering hot point which can just blow up at any provocation. But just it doesn't look like we are making any progress.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the conflict dynamics between India and Pakistan are, baffle world analysts, if you ask me. I go to do tabletop exercises or gaming of situations, as well as discuss what is happening. I've been a part of track twos as well. The truth is that there are some fundamental differences between India and Pakistan, and which we are not able to get beyond.
Is this critical for internal politics in Pakistan?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that what keeps it going?
Because it's internal politics, but it's also that weird mix they have, where the military is actually in charge.
Yeah.
They have a democracy, but there's no question, even inside Pakistan, everybody knows that you can write, as a journalist, you can write anything you want about their politicians. They pillory their politicians. But the military is untouchable. Now, so that is the basic mismatch between India and Pakistan. However, we have dealt with military democracies, military dictatorships quite well in so many places. Authoritarian regimes, we've dealt with them. With Pakistan, the third part is Kashmir. They have made it part of a kind of national narrative that they will somehow or the other be able to, unite the two Kashmiris. And we know that in 75 years it hasn't happened. I will say, and I've written about this as well, that the fact that the line of control remains a non-internationally recognized line in that sense. It's a monitored line, but it's not internationally recognized. It's not an international border. It allows Pakistan to use it because it's permeable and it's impermanent. Use it to launch training attacks, bring people over for recruiting. That's one. The second is, while that line of control is not a border, it gives people the false hope, those who want to be separate, gives them a false hope that there is going to be some grand, sort of free state or whatever. And I think the third is it keeps the Pakistani military dominant. So without that idea that Jammu Kashmir can be part of Pakistan at some point, the military would be devalued. They would lose currency.
So these dynamics looks like they're permanent in some ways, and irrespective of whatever happens, the current conflict, and hopefully it does not escalate beyond a point, we'll be back to square one, and it doesn't look like, can be progress even 5-10 years from now, because the dynamics that you mentioned, military will continue to be important in Pakistan. They will not concede anything. And it looks like on both sides, there's really no interest or, even ability to publicly acknowledge line of control as a permanent border.
That's true. That's absolutely
status
true. A leader, and I won't name him, a leader told me once, and I've spoken to leaders on both sides. I've interviewed both sides, prime ministers, on this issue. And one of them said to me once that the solution will not come from any of us. It will come only when there are two leaders who decide that they will not benefit from any kind of a peaceful solution, but their grandchildren will. You have to be able to see that. Now, right now, it is impossible to talk about peace with Pakistan because Pakistan is also going its own way. I mean, you can see that this particular military chief is not like the previous three ones. He's definitely, the speeches he has made definitely should have us much more worried.
Does Pakistan spend much bigger portion of their GDP on military compared to India?
Absolutely. I don't have the figures because I don't cover. But there's no question. There's a great book by a Pakistani author who I think doesn't live there anymore called Aisha Siddiqa, called Military Inc. And she writes about the idea that they have an entire industry. It's called, the 4G, sort of industry, which in Pakistan runs its own, factories. It has its own real estate business. It has an empire of its own. And it's, the famous cliche is always that it's not a state with an army, but an army with a state.
Yeah. But in some way, Pakistan is also in the grander picture, losing out. The general Pakistan population, the economic development just hasn't been there. I was just looking at the today stats. I think per capita income has fallen way behind compared to, where India is headed.
True.
So this whole thing is probably keeping military strong, probably create some political options, but no one is really winning from this.
Not at all. And they are also missing out, imagine, on such a large market right across the border from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just zooming out, let's go to look at the other two conflicts that are going on, which is, see, I guess the bigger picture there is, Suhasini, is in the past when conflict will happen, usually, the world powers that be, they will, try to mediate, get involved, influence, and so on. But just, 2 days ago, JD was saying, this is none of our business. It's at least, I have never heard, that kind of stance from America or, because which is also in some ways a free license for smaller conflicts, people to resolve their neighborhood issues on their own. How that it's a global peace order seems to be also crumbling.
Oh, absolutely. And, you just see that the first thing that is really hitting the global order, as it was known, the old order, the first is the idea that it is the global leaders that are violating the international rules-based system. So in Ukraine, for example, there's no question that Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty. It was a recognized border, which they went over. With Israel, they have literally, sort of stamped out every kind of international rule, humanitarian law, laws concerning even refugees, the kind of blockades on food convoys, those kind of things also. Of course, there's an international criminal court, but we don't accept that in India. We don't allow its mandate. But the fact is that has been done with the US's support. And then you have China, which has been, incursions, aggressions in the South China Sea. So we're looking at a system where if the world's top leaders, if you see the UN Security Council, France and the UK are not considered in the same. It's all basically about the US, China, and Russia. Each of them are somehow supporting the violations of international rules. So that's the first. The second is the United Nations as a body has lost its relevance. The UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, UN Secretary General will say things. Nobody seems to care. In fact, the mediation that we are seeing right now, for example, between India and Pakistan is much more from Saudis or UAE or even the Qataris getting involved. But the UN does not have that kind of stature at present. And I think the third is a kind of sense of crisis that we have come on. You started by saying that this is where we are. 25 years into the 21st century, what have we seen just in the last 5 years? COVID, which really devastated the world in so many ways, and the global economy and the impact on that. The Russian war, which also brought global sanctions. So that affected your food, fuel, fertilizer security as well. And then you see with Israel and Gaza, this permanent kind of instability in an entire region. Remember, India was planning this great connectivity project through the region. There's so many plans that have now been shelved for the moment. What happens with India and Pakistan? We have seen in the past that India and Pakistan are able to manage their differences. Eventually, something does come about, and I hope that happens in this case as well. But the truth is that we are living in a perennial crisis. And I think that has shaken people's faith in any kind of world order.
And what does that imply for people who are thinking about foreign policy? It's mostly going to be figuring out right alliances, which can be tactically or strategically advantageous, shifting alliances and so on. In the two conflicts you mentioned, India has a very interesting relationship with Russia, to say the least, right? And there looks like by all accounts, if you look at just from purely selfish interests, I think India is navigating it really well. We are benefiting in every possible way from that. And similarly, I think looks like, we have pretty strong ties with, Israel. And I think looks like India is again able to navigate that well. Is that basically in the global diplomacy looks like, you don't have absolute principles. You basically see like, what are my interests? Who are the other players? And how do I navigate that until, so that I am benefiting from this?
Well, Mukesh, the truth is it's always been that famous thing that there are no permanent friends or enemies. There are only permanent interests. So that has always been the basis of strategy, diplomacy around the world. The difference was that India as a country, if you ask me, had always punched above its weight because it had a kind of moral high. And the truth is that India has consistently worked to de-escalate other people's tensions, to help those who may be not much worse off than us. But there's always been that sense. India is also, and I always say it is a unique case in the world. It is one of the very few countries of its size, now the largest population in the world, that is pluralistic, secular, rule-abiding, internationally as well as locally, and is a democracy. There are very few parallels to it, maybe one or two other countries. Now, for India, this kind of sense of order and this kind has always worked because we have always thrived in it. We have done well. Actually, there is always this idea that somehow India has a grievance, has been left behind. But the truth is, India is a success story.
Of course.
And it's a year-on-year success story. I worked abroad for a while and then I came back. And I just find that year on year, there's something to look forward to in India. There's a real sense of optimism about our future. And that is because we are unique. If the moment we become something that is authoritarian, or we become something that is not pluralistic, or we start becoming, non-rule abiding, India loses a little bit of that. Now, you were asking about principles versus transactions. And the fact is, we are entitled to make sure that we are not hurt by other people's problems. That if they are fighting, then there's no reason why we should have to suffer and pay more just because, one side decided that this is the line, this is where we are going to go to war. And I think, in a sense, India has given up a little of the posturing. You heard the External Affairs Minister saying, we don't want preachers, we want partners. So we've become like that as well.
And what does that mean in terms of, now other people not getting involved in our conflicts, now that we have won, especially China, it looks like, whatever in the news that, look, Pakistan, a big portion of their supply does come from China. And if situation escalates, how will India navigate a relation with China? Do you think we have at least a very active back channel with China and you're able to, because China has in some ways, bigger fish to fry as well. They have to worry about America, and India is also considerably larger. And while China may or may not acknowledge, it's an important economy as well. We import huge amount of stuff from China. How does that economic interest between China and India versus a strategic relationship between China and Pakistan, how does that play out?
Well, we've always tried to separate it and build a relationship with China, which is not like the Pakistan relationship, but we do see China as one of our biggest threats. And military chiefs have now said that we have to be prepared for that two-front war. So far, what we have seen is when the LOC is hot, the LAC goes quiet. When the LAC is hot, the LOC goes quiet. We had a ceasefire deal with Pakistan negotiated while the Galwan clashes had just happened and the standoff in the LAC was going on. So I think we have tried to navigate it so that they don't become one common threat to us. But you're right that the Chinese support to Pakistan, both militarily in this particular conflict, as well as diplomatically. Their foreign minister saying to the foreign minister of Pakistan that we support Pakistan's right to defend itself and its sovereignty at a time when there had been no counterstrike by India is very telling, and we have to deal with it. At the same time, in fact, it was very funny because on the same day that this was happening, the Chinese ambassador to India had a opinion piece where he said that India and China must come together to fight the bullying tactics of Trump and go against the American tariffs. So it's almost like a quadrangle we are in: US, China, India, Pakistan. And it is important for us, firstly, not to be seen as fighting anybody else's war or taking on anybody else's enemies. That we have to deal with our threats on our own without expecting anything from other people. And as far as India and China's trade goes, the figures are there. China is frequently India's highest trading partner, even when there are restrictions on trade. There are no direct flights between India and China right now. Chinese companies cannot invest without going through extra security. Visas are not being issued. Despite that, China and the US, have about the same kind of trade with India. So it is telling that is where our supply chains are. And for China too, as you pointed out, a fight with India, how does it benefit China? We have a land boundary of 3,500 kilometers. For a China that is really focused on its biggest rivalry, which is with the US, that rivalry is going to play out in the Indo-Pacific. It's not going to play out here.
And I don't know, in this situational conflict, how does the global diplomacy works? And you may not know this, but do you think India and China will be talking to each other every few hours or right now? Because it's a very tricky situation.
So what is interesting is in the beginning, the conversations were not being held directly with Beijing. But what we have seen is twofold. One, that the NSA has been in touch with his counterpart, who's also the foreign minister there.
Right.
And so the National Security Advisor level, they are speaking. We also know that when India carried out Operation Sindoor, we brought in 13 members of the UN Security Council to brief them. And we, of course, didn't bring Pakistan, which is a member, and one more. Sierra Leone doesn't have a mission in India. But we included the Chinese envoy. So there is that acknowledgement that we are speaking to China separate from any of this. And I think conversations are definitely continuing between both sides. There's been no let up in that.
There is some narrative, and I think since there's so much fake news going around, who knows? But there is this sense that it's first time China's getting to test its new weapon systems in real world, which in some ways is a good preparation for for China to improve its arsenal, and because they've developed a lot of indigenous technology over last decade. Do you think that's a factor that Chinese will think about, or just too far-fetched?
Well, I would definitely say that having given Pakistan all the weaponry they have, all the hardware they have, the missiles, the planes, they would not like to see their hardware doing badly. That's a basic, right? That you would like to see it doing well against the other side, even if the other side is Russian hardware or French hardware, and that kind of thing. Whether China is actively pushing for an escalation, that has not yet been proven. In fact, all the statements have been to the opposite. But, international politics is not an ethical business necessarily.
And in that, so speaking of navigating ethics, how does US play this out? Again, if my understanding is correct, is there was, this, US has been also arms supplier for Pakistan for many, many decades because of all the history and so on. And there was, some order which was put on hold, I think, with the Biden administration, which Trump, in his first few weeks cleared. How does this play out? The US continues to supply?
No. For the moment, the US has cut most funding.
Okay.
And it's obligated to supply parts for the F-16s that they have with Pakistan, which they monitor. So if you remember during Balakot, when the F-16 story came out and India said they'd shot down an F-16, Pakistan's first response was, we have not used F-16s because they are not authorized to use them without, communicating with the US. US eventually did not confirm that an F-16 had gone down. But again, for them, to have lost to a Russian plane, it won't look good. Look, the US does have a strange relationship with Pakistan. Even in this situation, when it is very clear where they stand on cross-border terrorism, where they stand on the kind of terrorism coming out of Pakistan, it is very strange that they've put out these very even-handed messages, saying de-escalate and India and Pakistan can manage it. But you pointed out the real change, that if a J.D. Vance says, it's frankly none of our business. If a US President Trump says, they've been at it for centuries, they'll sort it out. For the first time, we are seeing the US actively shy away from an open role. Not because we are telling them not to, or not because they are doing something behind the scenes, but because they're actually saying, we don't want more problems. And I would say that the last decade, we blame Trump because there's a Trumpian flavor to speaking like this. But for the last decade, what we have seen is three things happening in the world. One is the aggression levels rising from China. And, in the 2010s, all this wolf warrior and, the kind of economic pressures they put on Australia, other countries. along with their military kind of aggression. The second has been the retrenchment of the US. So whether it is Mr. Trump walking out of the climate change accord or UN bodies or the Iran deal, or whether it is America essentially pulling out of Afghanistan, pulling out of Iraq, what we're seeing is a much more retrenchionist power. Somebody who's saying, I don't really want to get involved. In Ukraine and Israel, for example, they made it clear, our boots are not going on any ground. It doesn't matter where it is. We might, hit missiles on Houthis and that sort of thing, but we're not getting involved in any of this. And then to see them take this position and the India-Pakistan scenario when they are normally heavily involved. Do you know that the US doesn't even have an ambassador in Delhi right now?
Oh, I didn't know that.
They have not even named their ambassador.
After Eric Garcetti left.
Eric Garcetti is January, he resigned. So the point is that Mr. Trump has not even named someone because they will have to go through, congressional confirmation and all process. They've not even named somebody. So the fact that, obviously India and US are working at a much higher level. There's a FTA being negotiated and all that. But the truth is that we are seeing retrentionism. And the third, I think, is the rise of populism worldwide, where now countries are getting imbued with a sense of, that it's not about that global order. It is about me versus everyone else.
Yeah, I think I'll come to global order. But since you mentioned, FTA, we continue progressing on that with America, while this is going on, or some implication on the pace of it and the, content of the FTA, how it pans out?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the government has decided to put everything behind these FTAs, not just the US one. There's one with the UK, which just got done. There's one with Australia that has to be done. There's one with New Zealand, which actually we have promised to finish by the end of this year. And there's one with the European Union. There are others, GCC, the Eurasian Economic Union, those kind of multilateral ones, which may take a little longer. ASEAN has to be renegotiated. But these ones are actually, path-breaking because they are going to change how India sees tariffs. And how India sees market access, particularly in the issues of agriculture and dairy. So if India is willing to budge when it comes to the US asking for these things, then India is going to probably have to give similar kind of concessions to other countries. European Union, it has been a sticking point for 20 years. Australia as well, Australia and New Zealand, big dairy countries, have been wanting more market access to India. And so the US is pushing for these two things. Cut your tariffs, which frankly, when I speak to businessmen in India, they feel that maybe it is time for India now to consider a little less protectionism. And market access, if you are able to work it out and speak to your farmers groups and others, then, it makes India look like a much more secure, open power in the world.
Until, a couple of weeks ago, they were hearing that India will be possibly among the first few countries to get this free trade agreement done with America. But now that, we're distracted with this conflict, does that somewhere come in the picture? You think, we can still be business as usual? And FTA.
We're in the early days of a conflict, so it's hard to tell where it will end. So I can say that I can see paths to this finishing for both sides to eventually just deal directly and say, okay, let's put a stop to it for a third party to get involved and enforce something.
But India will not accept third party getting involved. Not publicly.
Well, now even that our position has changed. In the old days, we used to have three real principles. One was no hyphenation with Pakistan, which is nobody should be flying to one and flying to the other. No mediation, third-party mediation, particularly on Kashmir. But the idea being that after the Simla Agreement, everything was bilateral. And no internationalization of issues, no going to the UN. Pakistan has violated the third quite a bit. The second also, look, in 2019, Balakot, Trump was the one who announced that, the Indian pilot who had bailed into Pakistan, Abhinandan Watman, was being returned. So, and he had a role in that. The UAE had got involved. The Saudi Crown Prince had got involved. In this case, openly, we have seen the Saudi foreign minister in Delhi on Thursday, in Islamabad on Friday, and now they've issued a statement saying we are involved in de-escalation effort. So now you're seeing people saying it. So that second thing has also gone away. The third one, unfortunately, is something that that may happen to us, that we just get hyphenated. That, as you said, that when we're talking about India's economic prowess, that people say, yes, but this India-Pakistan issue is a problem. We had been able to de-link for at least, I think, 2 decades now. This. So we should be wary of not getting back into the situation where when people think India, they also think Pakistan. We don't want that.
Yeah. We were talking about Chinese weaponry in Pakistan, but as part of free trade agreement, even when Prime Minister Modi visited Trump, there was some discussion about was it about F-16s? India eventually importing bunch of stuff from America.
F-35s is what he said. Yeah, and J.D. Vance said it as well, although it may be another deal. This is one way of pushing India for a larger deal. Look, I think this is Trumponomics. So we have a Trump-Erica, there's Trump-plomacy, there's Trumponomics.
We live in the era of Trump, I guess.
And you know how he made his tariff calculations with some weird sort of equation.
GPT powered.
Which even made the penguins liable to pay tariffs in Hod and McDonald Island. But no, seriously speaking, Trump has said 3 things which don't necessarily bear out in economics, but he feels will help America. The first is that everybody has to zero out their tariffs with America, because America has always had low tariffs and everybody else's average tariffs are much higher, and India has been seen as one of the big violators there. The second has been his focus. Economists say it's not actually the what should be his focus, but his focus on the deficit. So if there is a deficit in India's favor, which has always been about $40 billion, then show me how you are equalizing that. So that's where he makes India buying energy, for example, from the US rather than from Saudi Arabia or from Russia or other countries. That he says, you make it up. You buy that much oil from me, or you buy that much LNG from me. Now he's also brought defense into this sphere. You buy American stuff. Of course, the last thing that he's now insisting is you make in America. That Indian manufacturers should show that they are making in America, that they are investing in America. And this is a continuation of the last time. So he has basically been discussing with India some kind of a large defense deal that would show India is deeply committed to the US supply chain on defense. We have our own problems. After all, you were mentioning the Indian relationship with Russia, and we all know that India's arsenal has been largely stocked in the past by Russia, although it's diminishing. The critical thing here is transfer of technology. The Biden administration started a little bit of the transfer of technology, but Russia does it. And in this conflict with Pakistan, what is really coming across as the thing that India has been putting forward is like its air defenses, the S-400. And it is essentially making, America is now making the case that you buy things from us. The big difference, and I'm not a defense expert at all, but the big difference I understand from the diplomatic negotiations is that in the old days, countries had what was called a kind of a la carte option. I'll buy this from you, I'll buy this from you. Today, everything's on a platform. So it's a buffet option. You just take this buffet or you take that buffet. And so India might get stuck. And is it possible for India to take a plane, like you said, an F-35, when we have other platforms that we have already paid for? We have other planes that we have already bought. The synergies will matter for us. But there's no question that Mr. Trump is linking this. This has never happened before. In the old days, relationships between two countries were never about the trade between them. Now the trade has become number one issue in the Trumpian era.
But naive view was great. I mean, India anyway is one of the largest importers of military equipment from around the world.
Sure.
America has excellent providers.
Exactly.
And given that America-China situation, America will, I would imagine, want India to be a strong counterweight to China. So powering India with American defense equipment. What's the catch here? It seems like it's as great.
It's a win-win. Otherwise, I think the catch is twofold. One is the transfer of technology, because we do get that from Russia, for example. In fact, this new deal with America that we're talking about would essentially mean here in Bangalore, producing both Russian and American engines or hardware.
We can mix parts and make something
on parallel assembly lines. The other catch is and this is something that's been voiced, is the idea that America keeps what is called a kill switch with it. that when it decides that it does not want you to use something, everything it gives a country comes with very heavy controls. And both proliferation controls as well as, on use as well. Obviously, formally, everybody will deny this is a possibility, but there's always that worry.
Hopefully, they're planning to exercise the kill switch in the current conflict, that will...
Well, I mean, I'm not sure they have that kind of clout right now. Just the fact that America doesn't seem to want to exert that influence is actually quite telling.
Yeah. Will they be okay? These F-16s that Pakistan has, getting involved in the conflict
I'm sure they're monitoring it very closely, and I'm sure Pakistan knows what the red lines are. I think this particular conflict has seen so much more Chinese hardware out there, whether it's the planes, whether it's the missiles that they claim, the air-to-air missiles that they're using. And now this is becoming, a war of the drones. The actual escalations we are seeing are about swarm drones, swarms of drones going across the LOC, which are still considered below the threshold of an all-out war. And some of them have come from Turkey, but some have come from China.
Have you actually seen physically these drones which are used in war? Like, we've all seen the toy drones we see in wedding pictures and for flying, but how big are these drones?
Today, you can see a photograph of a drone that has...
are they still this size or they're much bigger?
No, they're bigger. They're bigger as well. Okay. I've seen in a robotics factory in France, I think once. But I'm not a defense expert. So I keep making that point because even if you show it to me, I wouldn't actually know the difference.
But obviously, I think the drones have been also much talked about in the Ukraine-Russia war as well.
And Ukraine producing so many drones now.
So on one hand, I guess less people, getting involved and less, human casualty. On the other hand, the not much disincentive, as long as you have access to, thousands or even millions of drones, you just keep sending them.
And let's remember that in the previous part of this century, how the US has used drone warfare has been essentially, sometimes they get it wrong and kill, a wedding party in Afghanistan, for example. That responsibility is now a little removed. And as you were saying, perhaps, that, when you don't have a physical interface, you're essentially able to be a little more irresponsible.
I want to just, again, I think, can't resist coming back to India-Pakistan thing. Are there any learnings from the prior conflicts and then eventual de-escalation? This is what happens next couple of years. It's like, at some point, I'm assuming that this will end. Hopefully not too far in the future. And then things just continue to remain tense, or we'll go back to business as usual on all of that.
One of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is the complete shutdown of any bilateral communication.
Which doesn't affect us as long as, the rest of the life can go on.
The where it affects is when you actually go into conflict, when you find that there are really no mechanisms. We had a back channel for several years between the NSA and his counterpart, who's the DGEISI. We've had, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar going to Islamabad last year, but that was for an SCO event, but probably having some conversations with the leadership there. But apart from that, the general incentive of trade, of people-to-people ties, of any kind of contact at any level, even the Indus Water Treaty suspension means there goes one more mechanism where there may have been some kind of contact. So that makes it more difficult to find those off-ramps that you were speaking about. However, India has also shown in the past that we can manage these crises if it gets... After all, there was a accidental misfiring of an Indian missile that went into Pakistan, if you remember. This was about 3 years ago. And it was when we had no other communication going on, very tense times otherwise. But we were able to manage it. The DGMOs spoke to each other. Apparently, the back channel was activated. And they were able to bring down a situation that could have really gone out of control, right? I mean, Pakistan went to the international community after that. But actually, we had our own inquiry and admitted that it was a mistake. So it is possible to find those off-ramps if we want to find them, is what I'm trying to say. I think the third is, you were asking where this is going to go. The question is going to be what happens to the ceasefire that we negotiated in 2021. And unless somebody really tries to put that ceasefire back in place, that seems to have already, become a casualty.
And where does the fact that, both countries are heavily nuclearly armed, I mean, so far, I guess there's really no mention of that, but that must also be, playing in people's mind, or that just something, will not come in.
Well, Pakistan always uses the nuclear question as a kind of bogey to say this could get nuclear.
Yeah.
And for decades, the international community, I don't know if you remember the year 2000 when we had Operation Parakram, massive mobilization on both sides of the border. I used to be working in those days for an American company. And the daily call would be about two nuclear neighbors at, loggerheads with each other. Yeah. Could this go nuclear? To the point where we had drills about what to do. And, people were talking about fallout shelters and that. Even though in India and Pakistan, actually nobody was that bothered, because there's a general sense that there is a sense of responsibility around it. But I always do say that, the margin for a miscalculation increases as the conflict grows and the channels of communication get less. For example, in the middle of this, the Pakistani Prime Minister has organized a meeting of the National Security Council, the particular committee that looks at nuclear assets as well. It's normally seen as a bogey used by Pakistan, but it is a very irresponsible one.
Yeah. And do you think politicians are firmly in control of, this nuclear option there? Or
they're definitely not. I mean, but, these are issues that we thought we will not even have to discuss.
Yeah.
But if you remember in the Ukraine-Russia war, India actually got involved when there was some kind of suggestion that tactical nuclear weapons could be used.
Yeah. What does this mean for other neighbors and in general India's diplomatic and economic ties with the rest of the neighbors? I think India has had this neighborhood first policy and approach. With this conflict, does it push us closer to some of those, or each country will again think about how we should play? And
look, for the neighbors, it is always uncomfortable when the two biggest countries in the region fight.
Yeah.
It is uncomfortable. There's no question. And they've issued statements to that effect.
Yeah.
Nepal has issued, Bangladesh has issued. But at the end of the day, India has tried very hard to isolate its relationship with Pakistan from its relationship with the rest of the neighbors by, instead of SARC, for example, India now focuses on BIMSTEC. And despite our real serious problems with Bangladesh, Prime Minister Modi went to Bangkok a month ago. He met with the Bangladesh leader. So, India, it does put a lot of investment into the other neighbors. Where they eventually stand, I can tell you that on this issue of terrorism, India always gets support.
Yeah.
When it comes to a war, obviously, countries like Bhutan will always be close to India. The others may take a slightly less sort of.
So if you maybe just let's go around India and see some of the countries and see in the overall geopolitics, what is their role? One is each of them are in some ways economic partner, but probably not significant when it comes to size of the trade with these countries.
Yeah.
Porous borders there may be an issue from terrorism point of view because we have a huge border with many countries. I don't think any of them are military threat to us, but then there's a growing Chinese influence on those countries, and India may want to counter that, which we saw with Sri Lanka.
Yes.
So just if your perspective on where do these countries stand with respect to our kind of overall foreign policy?
I think when it comes to Bhutan, they have consistently said that they stand with India. However, after the Doklam crisis, what we did see is that Bhutan has its own parallel conversation with China on the border.
Yeah.
And if they were to actually have a deal with China, that would not work in our favor because, that Doklam Plateau is on a very sensitive area for us near what is called India's chicken's neck. Nepal plays both ways. So I wouldn't say when it comes to India, Pakistan, that any of these neighbors take Pakistan's side over India. I think to the contrary, because Nepal, for example, with India, we have an open border, we give each other citizens the same rights. They have, their military chief is accorded an honorary general position in our country. Our military chief does the same there. So we have a very close relationship with Nepal as well. With Sri Lanka, I mean, this is a country where we sent our troops to help them fight an internal war. But in the last few years, you are correct, we've been worried about what China is doing there. But I think their government now understands. And for the first time ever, a few months ago, Sri Lanka signed a defense cooperation agreement with India. We don't know the contours of it, but it is significant that they did it at all. Bangladesh is a little more difficult right now because after the change in regime, we don't get that same kind of support. I mean, after all, when Sheikh Hasina was there 2019, straight away there was support came. This time instead, it calls for de-escalation from Bangladesh. But they have also condemned the terror attack in Pahalgam, and they have made it clear that they just don't want to see the situation get out of control.
And what about extended neighborhood, on the east, Indonesia, Vietnam?
Well, Malaysia has issued a statement very much, in favor of Pakistan, because actually the Pakistani Prime Minister was due to visit Malaysia and he had to cancel his trip. And after that conversation, the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who had actually come to India last year, issued a statement more or less criticizing India and then calling for an independent investigation into the Pahalgam attack, that kind of thing. So Malaysia is obviously becoming a little of a problem. I mean, just in a quick sense, there is this idea that there is the UAE, Saudi, Gulf kind of leadership of the Islamic world. But there is also the sense that Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia want to be a kind of counter to those countries in terms of leadership of the Islamic world. So,
and on the west side, in the Arabian Peninsula, it looks like India is pretty close terms with all these countries you just mentioned, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Israel, etc. Right? So that's, I think, both economically as well as I think or geopolitically, those countries are at best neutral.
Ancient relations. We've dealt with these countries for years. Their civilizations, our civilizations. We have exchanged cultures for years. So.
Yeah. And what about the role of these smaller organizations like or things like G20, Quad, SCO, and so on? Do these organizations become more important, as we evolve into this whole multipolar world?
Well, what we've seen is they become more important when they're being hosted in India.
Right.
So our G20 was like, it was the place to be. But the subsequent years, we haven't seen G20 getting that kind of play. And this year in particular, it looks like the US is, because of its tensions with South Africa, the US has stayed out of the G20 process completely. So the question of what they hold. Look, multilateral organizations are dependent on their members for actually producing results. Because if the members are not interested, those...
and perhaps on these top 3-4 members, if there's, US lose interest or China, then, anyway.
Yeah, and also they have no power to enforce anything. It's up to every country to enforce whether they feel like it or not. But what they do is they give a global consensus. If you can forge an agreement, even if it's on 2-3 issues, you give a sense of where does the world stand, which is why it was important that India was able to forge a statement on the Russia-Ukraine war.
So it looks like then the bilateral is probably the most effective mechanism.
In today's date, actually the bilateral has become everything.
Do you think over next 5-10 years, we were talking about this whole global order, which kind of emerged in the aftermath of World War II and did its role, I think, navigating the whole Cold War and various other conflicts around the world and so on. At some point for India, being a member of Security Council was a very, very important topic. And now it looks like UN is pretty much losing its relevance. Do we see a future where most of these existing, global order organizations, becomes toothless and irrelevant slowly, without support from bigger countries?
Well, I think the real fear is that this global order has worn out its use, is obvious to the world. The fear is that it will not be replaced by another world order, but by no world order. Each man for himself, men behaving badly, no offense to men, and doing pretty much what they feel like doing. But, if you take a much broader view, in the 18th century, 19th century, there was a push towards what was called the Parliament of Man. there was a sense that colonialism had to end. So that was what was happening very much in the 19th century. The 20th century, World War II defined everything. The winners, the losers, although they decided also who the winners were. So that was the world order that we saw with the UN Security Council, but also things like, their economic frameworks, the WTO and that sort of thing. Today, there's no question that the next world order cannot cut India out. We're the largest population in the world. We're an important voice in the world. But the question is, how representative will it be? Can it represent the world without having an African member in it? Can it represent the world without looking at all the continents, South America, Australia, and that kind of thing? And also when it comes to countries like Germany and Japan, which were cut out because of their position 100 years ago, can you still cut them out today? Those kind of questions have to come. Can another world order be created? I think the time to start is now.
But most likely, as I said, it will not emerge because you need some kind of, major forcing function as well. Last time it was World War II and the whole world kind of decided we cannot have one more of such thing. And the most powerful country in the world, played a very active role in shaping that. But today, it doesn't look like, there is any strong impetus for trying to make it happen. And, the two most powerful countries are also not necessarily interested. I think at least US, this looks like it's not even interested in influence. Right, they see all this, their foreign military bases probably as a drag on economic drag and so on. China may want some economic influence, but probably
and they've got their own internal problems as well. So yes, you're absolutely right that we're not looking at a very grand future for global and multilateral order at present. Yet, these things are forged in crisis. And if the last 5 years is anything to go by, there is no dearth of crises coming our way. The problem is getting everybody to see things from the same lens. One would have thought the COVID pandemic would be a great unifier for the world. Instead, it showed us how badly the global powers could behave. Even the US, broke every supply chain, said, I will keep everything. China never told us where that virus came from. Just, refused, stonewalled any kind of inquiry. So even that COVID moment, as it were, where the whole world somehow suddenly took a step back and said, wait a minute, let's figure out what we're doing wrong. That did not lead to a pandemic accord, only just got signed and quite watered down. Didn't lead to us looking around and saying, climate change is an issue. We should really come together. So in so many ways, we ended up losing those opportunities. And then we saw crisis after crisis. So this is just 5 years we're talking about. So sometimes these things get forged in a larger crisis.
And it seems like, one big collateral damage of, this breakdown of global order is climate, crisis. It was a big deal, I think, for last 20 years.
Paris Accord.
Right. And now I think, drill, baby, drill. And, the oil price is cheap. Everyone. And with the advent of AI, pretty much, around the world, there is a huge hunger for more and more energy. And doesn't look like now this climate is on the agenda anymore in a meaningful manner.
Well, I think everyone who has made their transitions is not backing off. Right. All of Europe, for example, now moves on renewable energy. India has picked up so much in solar power. We're not going to completely backtrack on that and say we'll just work on oil. I think the larger question is going to be what is the next generation of transition technology? And who's going to fund it? Because so far what's been happening is, for example, the US had committed $100 billion over a certain number of... That's not coming. So who is going to fund that next transition of technology? Eventually, fossil fuels will run out. If you want to even mine critical minerals, which we are going to need for all our other semiconductors and everything that the world is moving towards, those will need a lot of energy. So I think right now we are in a position where there's no thought about the next gen. But I feel that countries that have benefited from their transitions are not giving up those benefits.
Got it. Yeah, hopefully maybe economic interest takes over.
Exactly. When how much cheaper it is. It's like an electric vehicle. When people start seeing the how much petrol they're saving on, it becomes an incentive.
Yeah, well, that's going to probably hand the problem for next generation to deal with, at least all the goals that were set in the Paris Accord. I don't think they're going to be active monitoring.
Net zero goals.
Right.
Yeah, any case, most of us will not be around to see it.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's someone else's problem, I guess. Just Suhasini, I want to go back to, you were just covering this whole global geopolitics, conflicts, etc. for a pretty long period of time. Do you see same patterns keep repeating, or things are always different, new nuances? Because you must have also a lot of, you have seen a lot of things, play out again and again.
I think the running theme that conflict is a constant, that crisis is a constant, is there. But the kind of conflicts are different. After all, in the 90s, we were always reporting on coups, assassinations. There are so many assassinations of leaders. And we were talking about a very different kind of conflict, which was tanks and, manpower and troops and that kind of thing. Today, look at this conflict where we're looking at drones. So the nature of the conflict has changed. I think also, as we've been discussing now for an hour, the kind of sense that there was a higher body in the world that behaved in a certain way, that had checks and balances, has gone away. So even if the UN Security Council now puts out a resolution, nobody cares. And most of the time, they can't even agree on a resolution. So I think that has changed the nature of conflict, because especially in so many countries where we see authoritarian leaders carrying out conflicts on their own people and not feeling any kind of heat from the international community, that is dangerous. And it certainly doesn't make the situation better. But, one thing that so many have pointed, I think Shashi Tharoor says it, a lot of people who deal with the UN, is compared to 100 years ago, we have less conflict, not more. When you look at the millions that died in the world wars, we do have less conflict, and less conflicts involving humans dealing with each other. So maybe that is the one silver lining.
Yeah. Hopefully it stays that way, with the third conflict, pretty much starting, third, and maybe the fourth and fifth. You never know, where does it go. But let's
I think
stay optimistic.
It means that certainly our jobs will, or constantly have work and as journalists. I tell you, one place where I feel a little sad is I see diplomats now very openly saying there's no point in diplomacy. And then that's sad, because eventually all, order has been based on people working militarily, but also diplomatically. And that diplomatic track is today under a lot of strain.
I think there's a relevance from the larger public discourse. I know you have very popular, podcast or this property, worldview, where you cover, things which are relevant in depth, add a lot of color and nuance around that. But if you contrast that, we live in the world of, just short tweets and fake news and so on. Like the things you're discussing, there is a lot of complexity behind the scenes. There are, economic interest, there are political interest, there is a history, there is a art of, diplomacy, a lot of give and take, a lot of intense negotiations are involved. But what we read in headlines is just, very black and white. And there's a little of, we need more of that as well, for generally people to understand, why
people Mukesh, I'll be honest, you've been very kind to talk about worldview. It's something I've actually worked on both at the Hindu and before that at the CNN IBN where I was. But the truth is, I will probably get more people listening to me off your podcast than I will, with all my combined sort of my own podcast. But I'll tell you, there is a niche. There are people who will come up to me and say, thank you for speaking in a simple tone. And, there's always been this idea that diplomacy is something very, sophisticated and arcane and can only be, decoded by very, very sort of intellectual and experienced people. But eventually it affects us. Everybody knows how much diplomacy affects us. And so I think that is the niche. The niche is eventually that all we're trying to do in journalism is what is the communication business. So credible, verified information, not necessarily coming the first, but making sure that it is actually correct, what you're saying, that has a place. And I do think, and I hope that more people will see that is also a niche. Obviously, everybody's getting their news off a cell phone and a message and all of that. And that has its own place. But the idea that somebody will also be interested in saying, let's take a step back. What's actually going on over here? So there's a lot of space for different kinds of journalism. And I'm very happy to have that little niche to be able to discuss what are otherwise seen as very complex issues. And break it down in a sense of how does it affect us as Indians,
In my college days, my favorite newspaper was Hindu, primarily because, it was just, everything was covered in depth and a lot of nuances, compared to other newspaper where you'll get, a little bit, more news of the day, and that the focus on, analysis and depth is something, I appreciate. I don't read newspapers anymore, unfortunately. But I think as someone who's interested in what's happening in the country, and also I'm curious, I want to understand, I think something needs to be done about just overall standard journalism as well. I think there is this niche that you're referring to, I think probably there is to be demand as well.
I have to say, I'm stunned when I see fake news and things running on channels willing to just put their own reputation at risk. I mean, 2 nights ago, we saw channels had to actually apologize for the stuff they put out about what had happened. It is possible with social media also to have fake news, which is why I think legacy media always will remain, because somebody who's spending money to get reports and get credible reports. But at the end of the day, a journalist is nothing if not credible.
Yeah. That's
the
right.
point is, the moment you are seen as someone who is sensationalistic and someone who can even, use information that's not verified, then you lose your byline, you lose your credibility. So to me, that's the most important. There's nothing else that is more important than that.
Yeah. No, I would like to, Suhasini, end on the note by just reiterating, right? I think we live in a complex world which is evolving very dynamically. There is a lot of color and nuance behind it. And, people like yourself, who take effort to, in some ways, go behind the scenes and really bring out the story with, all its, details and color is, I think, very important. It's something, people need to know.
Yeah, you make it sound like a lot of work. I'll be really honest, I enjoy my job. And I believe very, very much that if you love what you do, it's not really work. I'm sure you feel the same way in so many different fields.
Yes, it's difficult to do. Like, I think we have worked for nearly similar amount of time. You can't do something for, 3 decades unless you really enjoy. But I hope, maybe a lot more people check out Worldview as they listen to the podcast. I think they'll learn a lot more about, what's happening in our world. And because, as you said, what is happening in the world affects us directly or indirectly.
Absolutely. And much more every passing day.
All right. Thank you, Suhasini. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you, Mukesh.
At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.